I'm showing about 4 after the hour. Why don't we go ahead and get started and anticipate a couple others joining us. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you here. Many of the same faces we saw late last week and a couple others. So I think I'd like to, have this meeting go as well and productive as last week's meeting of Legislation and Authority Group went. We've got a couple key recommendations to follow up from the last meeting. Aaron, if you just pull up the agenda real quick and I'll just walk through that so everyone knows where we're headed today. Okay, just a quick introduction here. And again, the primary purpose is to just finish up what we can on the recommendations, recognizing there'll still be an opportunity going forward for some additional tweaks and adjustments. And most of it, today's session is really a work session. We'll walk through the recommendations. I was pleased and appreciative of the input that I received from many of you on a couple of those recommendations that we'll get into since our last meeting. So thank you for the additional work. We'll also spend some time today if there's any additional recommendations that have been floating around in your head and you want to make sure are recorded and get those on the books here. We'll talk about those. And then we have a meeting next Monday of the full task force, which is going to be largely dedicated to a report out. And when I say a report out, it'll be relatively high level. Doug, I know I conscripted you last week to lead the Legislation and Authority report out. Yeah. But I think it's really going to just be some high level salient points about what we discussed where there seemed to be consensus, and certainly wouldn't have the time to get into the kind of discussion that we are during these subgroup meetings. And I know Elizabeth Riggs from our firm, who's kind of the point of the spear on this project, will be following up individually with those folks that'll be reporting out, just to give you a little additional guidance. So just be aware of that. And then we'll adjourn the meeting and get the turkey in the oven. So that's what we've got planned for today. Before I get started, any comments or questions? Anything that anyone wanted to bring to our attention? Okay. All right, great. Thank you. I want to switch back to the tracking sheet, Aaron. So just to kick things off, you're obviously familiar with this document by now. We've been tracking those changes and some of the discussion that has occurred previously. The first one we adopted at the last meeting. The next one down here is one we want to spend some time today talking about, along with the fourth one down too, the work that Brian and Brad did that I had sent out yesterday. So why don't we go ahead and start with the 2020-03G there, Aaron, at the top, or the second one there. And this is one that, of course, we had talked about a revolving loan program for rehabilitating dams, high hazard and publicly owned dams. Evan was good enough to reduce some of his thinking on this to writing, which was also shared ahead of the meeting today. Hopefully you've had at least a few minutes to review that. And I guess while Aaron is pulling that up for discussion, maybe I just kind of turn it over to Evan just to kick it off. Evan, share with the group what it is you're thinking here, the motivations, rationale for the language that's being proposed. And then we'll...
Yeah. And just real quick, Mark, which am I pulling up this language here?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
So the red text, and it looks like some of the black text disappeared, but basically a lot of added text here. If you recall, our discussion was kind of around does the loan program really kind of cover everything? We had one recommendation, and it seemed like we were trying to split it in two to ensure that removal was specifically called out, which is, I just kind of labeled it 03G parentheses 2. But they both read fairly similar, just the idea that we should be talking about both funding and financing. Certainly it would be great if it was only funding and we didn't have to pay anything back, but that's probably unrealistic. But also wanted to allude a little bit, to provide a little bit of a roadmap to what should be addressed, if and when this is dealt with, which of course would need to be legislatively. The one thing that's not in here that we really haven't discussed, that I have discussed with Mark, I don't want to get off of these words, but if you get the idea that covering both a program to repair dams and a program to remove dams both make sense, and that we can provide a little guidance here. At some point, since we're the funding committee, we probably have to start sticking dollar amounts to various things. And that's a whole nother can of worms that I don't know that we need to get into right this minute. But I don't know if there's any questions. I think this is pretty self-explanatory stuff.
Yeah, I just might add to that, Evan, and I know in talking with Eagle staff, there's some efforts underway to kind of consolidate or at least organize some of the money discussions from the other subgroups all together. And I think we'll see more of that at report out on Monday. Yeah. And you also here left some notes about some initial dollar amounts. And I guess while we don't necessarily need to get into the nitty gritty of those, I think what I might do is be interested to know, and maybe this is, I'm guessing it's part of the conversations going on in Eagle right now as they look at the different programs, putting some boundaries around or at least some targets for potential funding levels that will make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and on that point, I guess as long as we're a little bit into it, 215 million was identified in 2013. It appears that ASDSO, I think in partnership with another group, has also updated that information nationally on a state-by-state basis. And I saw a figure that was almost $400 million attached to Michigan. A little unclear in the resources, but it appears to be a 2019 number. But the bottom line is, it appears that somewhere between $200 and $400 million has been estimated for repairs based on a pretty solid rubric from ASDSO. It appears to be based on, the experience of many dam program managers as to average costs, if you consider height and age of dams as two important proxies. There's a lot more to it. But that does not include a dollar amount for removal. And that's an area where I know that Eagle staff has been sort of dig into the book and figure out what's that been looking like. Last thought I'll put out there is that ASCE information that's in our report in appendix, I want to say B, I may be wrong about that. I wrote it down when I sent the note out anyway. ASCE indicates that based on interviewing SP staff, that since in the period from 2009 to 2018, there were 24 removals, I want to say, and an average of 22 permits issued for repairs on dams during the year. It's unclear, how extensive those permits were, but if you do that math, that adds up to touching 25 structures a year, which is around 10% of the system. I don't think 10% of the system has been totally brought up to snuff necessarily, but just other information about what's been going on out there. Again, back to the language, though, that we've got. People have any concerns in 3G? I felt it was important, I guess, to include a little bit of a, reflection in that process. You've got to establish scoring criteria to hand out funds, but on the other hand, the biggest recommendation is to figure out the best ways to reduce the risk profile of the whole portfolio. And that seems to me something that might not be sorted out by the time you are initially able to offer funds. So I did include the second sentence in each of this is basically providing some guidance that Eagle should be periodically reevaluating the scoring criteria. And I just thought 5 years might be a reasonable time frame. Every 5 years, take a look and see what are your KPIs and are you on risk, the portfolio risk or not. So I'll leave it at that.
A quick question, Evan. I just want to be clear. Was the $215 million to $400 million that was just for publicly owned dams?
No, that was for all dams that are in that Eagle is aware of. So what Byron took a look at, he did 3 separate spreadsheets. One was for publicly owned regulated dams, privately owned regulated dams, and also a figure was put together for unregulated dams, so that 1,000 that are not part of the regulated system. I thought that maybe was a little low. Marty Helmgren, suggested maybe it's not totally out of whack. And when I looked at some of the nuts and bolts they did without fully comprehending it anyway, on the spreadsheet Byron did a while ago, it's a rubric that seems to make sense that comes straight from ASDSO. And it was calced at 215 million in 2013, and in 2019, ASDSO did a general update and tagged that at 377 million. I just used 200 to 400 since none of us really know, rounding.
So moving forward on this language, then Evan, is this like entire statement here, would that be the amended recommendation language then?
That's my recommendation right now for us to adopt. I certainly understand that in writing a report, one might shorten up the bullet points, yet still provide that full text, in a lengthier narrative.
Mm-hmm. And then they would be 2 separate.
I see them as 2 separate, but they're related. Again, I just kind of said our tree has branched a little bit on O3G, and it's got 2 branches to it.
Mm-hmm.
G1 and G2.
Okay.
If I can maybe invite Eagle staff to weigh in here for just a moment before we open it up to the others. What you just heard as far as the numbers or the language, getting a look at it here first.
Yeah, so some anecdotal stuff, right? Michigan removes about 5 to 6 dams a year. And we're currently usually in the top 5 or top 3 of states who are removing dams. Pennsylvania used to remove about 30 a year. They're down to about 10 or 12. But recently, California has really come on strong, and they're removing upwards of 20 or 25 dams per year. That said, we have a few grant programs that can help dam removals, but the former dam management grant and then a couple of aquatic habitat typically aren't one-stop shopping, but when dam management was started in 2011, it was funded at $2.5 million that year, and I think we did 6 or 7 pretty good projects from that. That's that's leveraged with other federal grants and match dollars and things like that. At 350,000, it's more like maybe 2 or 3 projects that we can help with. So with that being said, if Evan's numbers were just averaged out, you had that 200 to 400 and some million over 20 years, you're talking 10 to 20 million per year in available funds. You could do feasibly 20 or 30 good projects a year easily, which would be huge. I think that would be tremendous, So I think that those numbers seem to be reasonable if you could maintain that funding level or that, and take on that many projects in a year, and you could do some large scale rehabilitation or removal of dams in that probably 15, 20 projects per year, ballpark, and I think so. But yeah, I think that's, your average dam removal ranges from 100,000 to, tens of millions, but probably mostly in the $1 to $3 million range for a dam removal project. Dam rehabilitation is probably, on the order of a few $100,000 to, $1 or $2 million typically. Can be more, but that's probably the typical range. So just to throw some ballpark numbers at it.
Thank you, Luke. Other comments, questions from subgroup members or other staff, feel free to weigh in here.
Just so I'm clear, the second recommendation is for any, it's not just publicly owned, right? If we're looking to do removals, is that what that's saying?
You know, I neatly sidestepped all of that by using the word public trust. So Bill had suggested, I think before, that there are situations where you might have a privately owned dam that does have high priority. And of course, the rubber hits the road in what your scoring criteria is to get across that threshold. I would have to say that just today in researching the New Jersey program, what I saw in their application form was pretty neat. It's primarily targeted, eligible applicants can be public agencies, or a private agency can apply if they have a public agency cosign. And this speaks a little bit to what the legislative group was talking about the other day, the idea that somewhere along the lines, when a privately owned dam is near and dear to people's hearts, it's kind of a local issue. And perhaps there is a role for county government or another LUG to get involved with that. And to provide a pathway for those situations, it would make sense to have something that maybe mirrors what New Jersey has. I thought that was a neat idea. And it just expands on something that Doug had thrown out there and developed. Maybe. That's the answer to your question. Maybe. Maybe.
No, I guess if it was going to be a straight up dam removal where we're taking out essentially all the risk, then there may be value in that. I guess that's where I was thinking.
Yeah. Yep.
Would that necessitate a slight language change? I mean, it's nuanced here for obvious reasons, as Evan's explained here, but I guess what I want to do is get us to an area where this group is comfortable for the most part, that, you know, maybe it's 90% and it, you know, might benefit from some additional scrutiny, but for today's purposes, it gets us, you know, where we want to be.
I think it does. It does say all regulated dams, right?
Well, what about the unregulated dams that we
Yeah.
want out?
Good point.
Did it just say all dams?
Yeah, you could just even leave out for all regulated dams, shorten it up, just enhance dam removal.
Thoughts, comments from others?
This is Brian. I think for a very succinct couple of paragraphs, you've done, very well speaking to the notion and doing it in a general fashion, not knowing what level of detail is kind of desired from us. Like you, Evan, I think we could dig into a lot of questions and details of how it would work, the mechanics, the cost estimates. But I think that what is there now is a very, very nicely concise description of it.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
So are we in agreement about adopting these two parts?
I think so. I just wanted to hear it. Douglas, you've been kind of quiet today. You're thinking on this?
I am, but I'm satisfied so far.
Okay.
I'm sure in the end, we're going to have little bits of mismatch between our various writings and discussions, and we're going to have to reconcile those. But
Okay. I can assume silence is consent then here. Sounds like.
I'm not shy.
Go onward.
I guess one other concept I want to throw out that I had learned about in discussions with Pennsylvania's dam safety program, and it doesn't change the language here, but just as far as considerations, maybe for some of the mechanisms on this moving forward. I know under the legislative subgroup, we were talking about, proof of financial responsibility. And one of the programs that they have in Pennsylvania right now is basically kind of to piggyback on that requirement for proof of financial responsibility is they offer a bond program to dam owners, to private dam owners, and they allow these dam owners to pay an annual fee for their bond, and that accrues up to a certain dollar amount. And once it gets, to that target dollar amount, when it goes beyond that, they start opening up that fund for applications for loans, basically for repairs. So kind of tying that in with the revolving loan aspect, it does provide an avenue potentially for some dollars for loans that eventually, obviously at the start, there needs to be some initial sum of money that goes into it, but it provides an avenue where, the dam owners are helping to finance this loan program. And then additionally, obviously having this bonding program there, and that amount, when emergencies do come up, they're able to tap into that if those dam owners aren't responsibly taking care of their dams or their issues.
But where did the money come from initially, Dan, to set up the bond? The state just assuming the responsibility?
So I didn't get all of the information from the current dam safety chief. I'll have to press him more to dig into that more to figure out if there was an initial investment that was provided for the bond side of it. He did say I think he had indicated that they had gotten to a loan, gotten to the target amount to hit a loan program shortly, and then they've expended funds out of that program, and so they're still building back up to the target again. So I don't think that they've actually utilized it for the loan program much at all yet. But I'm assuming it was some appropriation that basically kind of started it off as part of that emergency fund program.
This was Pennsylvania, Dan?
Yes.
Okay, so we do have Pennsylvania listed there as a resource.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like. So maybe a little more detail if we said, consider Pennsylvania's bond program over just in the existing resources, I would say, Aaron, just so we make note of that and at some point take a little deeper dive into that language and learn how they got to where they are.
Can I ask a question? I was understanding Dan to say that this was more about the security bond, the assurance fund. So rather than someone going to the open market, you picture this, right? I'm the HOA president and I have to call a whole bunch of insurance companies and explain to them what coverage I'm looking for and get a quote from them. Or I could just go to the state, which has said, if you have a dam that looks like thus and so, this is your annual charge for this required insurance. Feel free to go get your own from a bank of your choice, but your insurance policy is essentially through the state. Am I hearing you correctly on that, Dan? So a different bond.
Yes. So their option would be either go after or utilize this program, or they could hold their own, go and get their own bond or a certificate of finance or something like that. I can't remember what it was called.
Yeah, that's
it wasn't
because that's a brilliant plan though, because I'm sure a lot of private owners that's a challenging thing to get somebody to back you, and you have some spillover.
In Michigan, they've actually, the insurance companies, last I had heard, were actually pulling out policies that provided coverage to dams.
Yeah, so I think that that's probably one of the quirks. I mean, when I hear about that, it is pretty interesting in the sense that if we require financial assurance or insurance programs and the marketplace does not want anything to do with providing those, right, then this may be one of the few strategies to create such an insurance program. And I guess the other thing then is, does the state of Michigan want to get in do they want to get into kind of the group insurance business if the marketplace doesn't want anything to do with it either?
To be really clear, they're not, they are not providing insurance on the dams. So like they're not covering if the dam fails. It's providing the bonds basically if the dam owner isn't taking necessary steps to complete, maintenance or repairs or things like that in order to maintain the safety of the dam, the state then can tap into those bonds to do the work themselves.
Hmm.
So it's,
Sorry, I put the word insurance in there.
yeah, so it's not an insurance policy.
Good food
Okay.
thought, though. I mean, you probably do need seed money, to Bill's point, but you are receiving revenue on an annual basis to build that kitty. And I suppose it depends on if you got 500 or 1,500 dam owners that see that state program as their best bet. So I agree with Mark. We might not want to sort it all out today, but
Right, yep.
it's worth noting. And I don't know if it fits under this or if it's G3 or a whole new thing, but.
Hey, Evan, before we move on, I had two real quick things I wanted to share kind of as like placeholders. Pennsylvania also has a very, very creative strategy for funding dam removals that we could talk about if we have time. And Indiana has implemented a requirement of insurance policies for low head dam owners. I think it's a nominal, like $1 million liability insurance policy, but it might be interesting to follow up with both. I can kind of explain the Pennsylvania thing. It takes a little while, but the insurance, it might be worth following up with Indiana and saying, how are dam owners getting insurance? What companies are not backing out when we have a failure and, canceling policies and things like that, as just something to follow up with on later.
Yeah, I mean, you can explain it, or I just didn't get to Pennsylvania as robustly as New Jersey. I think just looking at the scoring sheet, can kind of take the place of 1,000 words.
Yeah.
On what's the score sheet look like for a Pennsylvania's, removal program. Maybe there's more to explain, but I'm happy to dig into that and look it up or partner with Luke on that and provide more information.
Yeah, we can do it if there's time at the end of this meeting, or we can take it offline, but it's a really interesting, cool strategy that they were able to get like 30, 35 dams out a year for a long time. And now it's down because the low hanging fruit are gone, but they're still doing 12, 15 a year. So, I mean, they've had very good success removing problem dams in Pennsylvania.
But they legalized pot too?
Maybe, I don't know. No.
Okay, good. Let's keep moving. Thanks for that input, Luke. It looks like we've covered those pretty good for the time being. We might circle back to this discussion if there's time at the end of the meeting. Is that fair? Okay. Let's move on down then to 2020-05D there. This is one that talked about Dam Safety Emergency Fund. Brian and a couple of folks agreed to work on that, at least conceptually, some language there. Brian was good enough to follow through on that, and I shared that information late yesterday. So as is customary, Brian, I guess I'd turn to you and maybe just sort of offer sort of a high level thinking on where you landed here.
Sure. Let me start by apologizing to Brad. My notes from the meeting weren't very good, and I thought it was Jim. And so, Brad, I prevented you from helping and reviewing, so I apologize. I didn't mean to, but also my apologies to Brad and my appreciation to Jim.
No worries.
So let's say that. Sorry about that. So, I did not hit the beautiful conciseness that Evan achieved with his, but a lot of this is just trying to capture our discussion. So the first bullet point basically just, reiterates that the permit fees that was mentioned in the ASDSO report just really won't be a viable source to make this emergency action fund happen. But under the second number 2 heading, the purpose and use, just to clarify, this is different than the revolving loan program, and that this is the pot of money that's intended to be accessible when dam safety program staff really see that some immediate action needs to be taken, and we are failing in the short term to get the dam owner to take responsibility for that. And the repairs do need to be, the repair or drawdown does need to be done immediately. And, you know, the other clarification that's in there is that this isn't supposed to be any repairs. You know, say a dam really needs a spillway enlargement or something of great substance to be long-term viable or sustainable. This isn't meant to, you know, put up a couple $1 million necessarily to do those longer term fixes. It's really meant to be a short-term actions that remove the immediate risk. We tried to talk a little bit, again, not knowing exactly where we're headed to in the level of detail of this task force final report, not knowing whether we should get into the details of funding mechanisms and amounts. We did make some effort to try to figure out how this could work and how much money it might need. Luke and Dan helped with this a lot, and some of these are just, some of them are informed by good numbers. Some of them are just me trying to do some napkin calculations just to put something ballpark on paper to start. And so you'll see kind of in there that, I guess I'll just get right to it, is that, you know, roughly what we've come up with is a notion where, you know, say roughly $5 million from general fund would be put into a specialized account for this purpose that can remain in there and not revert. Roughly 5 million is just comes about thinking through the number of incidences like this that would have either have recently needed this sort of action or could have used it. Has been, I think, you know, 4 or 5 this last year, which seems to be a little higher than normal, but that might actually be the trend that we're heading in. Who knows? And, you know, Luke helped kind of think through that there's, you know, jumping over to the other page, there's roughly what, a little short of 90 dams right now that are either in unsatisfactory or poor status, but only about 20 of those are in the high or significant hazard ratings. But we do have kind of 20 that we know are right there now, and some other, you know, sizable number that are behind that. So if we sort of combine the notion of, you know, maybe somewhere around 5 a year, but we also have some front loading, some issues that we know about to take care of. Just for purposes of, you know, roughing it out, we figured, you know, let's figure out about 5 of these projects a year. I heard from Luke and Dan that, you know, they're pretty variable costs associated with them. They can be, you know, maybe $20,000 or $50,000, and some of them can go up over $1 million to do these basic things. Sometimes drawdowns can be done relatively simply. Other times, even a drawdown can't be. You can end up with some sediment dynamics behind the dam that make it complicated and pricey quick. So we just sort of, you know, split, you know, a couple of, you know, a little over $1 million, or, you know, $50,000 for some, said roughly, you know, maybe a $200,000 a year average. About 5 projects a year would be about $1 million. And so those numbers aren't that critical, but the notion was that, you know, we would try to start it out with about $5 million in this pot. So of course, you know, it doesn't have to be revived every year. Money is available there. And if there's a pulse and, you know, these folks get 10 of them or 15 of them in a year, there's some extra money available there. Some of the other write-up here just mentions that, you know, most of this action would recovery of the cost would be pursued. But as we've kind of heard in some of our past discussions, 100% cost recovery is not likely. So it's, you know, again, we're left with kind of a hard way of figuring out how long a 5-year average investment might last. It might last 10 years, might last less, might last longer, depending on cost recovery. That would be recommended to go back into this pot. Let's see what else is in here. You know, there's a little bit here about just reporting through time. So you can imagine we set this fund up, ask for an initial investment that is, you know, our best projection of a couple of years worth of need, and through time, you know, we report to the legislature on how many projects have used it, what the consumption of the fund has been, what the cost recovery has been like. And we were kind of thinking through the notion that the fund should really never dip below about 2 years worth of projected use as a general rule, so it's available there at all times. But it would need periodic renewal based on how cost recovery and the use dynamics go. But, you know, a hypothetical one would be we start out with the $5 million at year 7 or 8, you know, we start hitting that 2-year mark or $2 million. And, you know, each year you report to the legislature and say, hey, we're getting down, and you go through it and you seek another investment of general fund to refund it.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Where is that? Finishing up there? Okay.
Oh, and I think one of the last notes there is simply that, well, I guess I think note number 6 just said that in some of the other states, or in, I guess maybe it was the ASDSO model state program information, there was some extra language about the ability of the state, if they use something like this, to place liens, just to aid, again, in a little bit better cost recovery. And then I think bullet point 7 just recognized that, you know, we've kind of kept the notion of this emergency action fund and how it would work separate from these notions of revolving loans or a bond issuance program, or even the dam removal program. There probably is a way, and it looks like maybe some other states have combined these concepts. There might be some utility into doing that. I guess in theory, with a revolving loan, some of the interest might be able to continuously put money in here, but obviously from a policy perspective, it would also get a little complicated at this point to merge those concepts into one fund. So we've just kind of kept it here, again, not knowing the exact level of detail we should head to with the task force recommendation. That's it.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Brian. There's a lot there. Let's open it up for questions, comments, thinking on this, including Eagle staff. If you've got any input, we'd also welcome that.
Let me just start by just asking a couple questions, Eagle staff. In terms of the enforcement, if you find you've got a dam that's high hazard and you're concerned about it, what do you do initially? What do you do? Be it publicly owned or privately owned?
Sure. So go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was to say, so I mean, the first thing we do if we've got a structure that we're concerned about is we reach out to the owner and we start through basically a series of compliance communications and try and work with that owner to get them into compliance, to get their dam safe. And then, you know, if we're not succeeding there, then we start moving to notices of violations, in which case we're basically informing them that they have to take action, and we now have the authority to start levying fines.
Okay, what are you limited to in fines? How much fines can you levy?
Was it, Luke, 10,000 a day?
Well, it's okay.
It's sizable.
Okay.
But like I said, all of our stuff is through circuit court action. So, you know, we can instill those fines, but if it gets contested, we still have to go to court and get an order to get any cost recovery.
Right.
And then the final measure that we have is if they are still not complying, is we can issue an emergency order. And then at that point in time, we're basically telling them that they can go and make the necessary repairs themselves, or we have the authority to go out and make those repairs and try and recover those costs through circuit court.
Over what period of time does this process go if it takes the full process?
Depends on the situation. We've had some instances where, you know, it's a matter of a couple of weeks to escalate to that point of issuing an emergency order. And other instances, you know, it really all depends on the response of the owner. You know, if it seems like we're getting efforts to move towards compliance, you know, it's going to take longer. We're going to be trying to work with them to get back to that point.
If you were compelled to do that, what fund source would you use today?
I would be going up the ladder and hoping and praying that we can find the money.
So I think a couple things to add to that, we have issued emergency orders, within like a day. If it's so urgent, and the remedy is quick, like Brian said, so sometimes we can just go out and pull stop logs or open a gate and the crisis is over, right? We've drained the pond over a series of days and the risk is greatly reduced. Some of them, like some of the other projects we're talking about, could be months or years of planning and engineering design and millions of dollars in cost to implement a risk reduction measure that achieves, the desired, outcome, which is to prevent dam failure. So it's all contingent on if the dam owner is playing along or stringing us along or stonewalling us or whatever, that's kind of helps with the, determine the urgency, and also the condition of the dam can really determine the urgency and the complexity of the whatever risk reduction and that measures are needed. So it is really across the board. More typically, we can go out and probably do a drawdown or at least a partial drawdown and kind of buy some time to work with the owner. But like I said, when it gets to the point where we're issuing orders, it's usually because the owner is, not complying and not responding in a way that's meaningful. Or in some cases, they actually want us to issue the order to help compel some action by whoever holds the purse strings or to resolve some issues. So it really is across the board.
Thank you.
That's helpful. So if the have you had any that have gone to that level where you've had to cost recover in the last several years, where you've gone in and spent money to create to fix a problem, and then you're into cost recovery?
Yeah, we have. I will mention before I get into that, it's a bit of a catch-22, right? Where we don't really have a funding source, so there may be some reluctance to go to emergency order and us taking action without a clear plan on how to, if we have to step in, right? So there might be some reluctance, so it might be kind of isolated to those instances where there's no other choice, right? And then we're left scrambling to try to find the funding. But we have, the most recent is in Corunna. There's a small old mill dam there that we ordered drawdown. It got contested, so we issued an emergency order, hired a contractor, did some stabilization work, and pulled the stop logs out and drained the pond. And it was on the order of like $15,000 total, and we were able, because we were prevailed in the court actions to contest that order, that the court just ordered them, as part of that action to repay us the money. So we didn't have to file a separate, action to cost recover, because we prevailed on the contested, when they contested the order, and as the judge just tacked on the order to pay us back the money that we had paid. So that was the only time. On several all the other ones that I've done in the past 10 years, have they been a drawdown where department staff just went to the dam and conducted the drawdown. So the cost was just staff time, and we didn't actually seek cost recovery because the juice probably wasn't worth the squeeze on that one. It's just part of what we're doing there is just go ahead and go do it and chalk it up as a loss, But so that says we're probably kind of reluctant to take on the ones that cost a lot of money because there's not a good system for it. The other ones we've been able to do kind of just very cheaply.
I was saying, in my limited experience, I've had one that I issued actually, I don't remember if I actually issued the emergency order, but I know I issued a notice of violation, and we were very close to an emergency order. And basically at the thought of litigation, the owner finally complied and took action. In the other instances, the one we're working on right now at Edenville, and we're looking at millions of dollars, thankfully we've been able to, I'll say, get a little bit lucky, and we've got federal funds that are helping to supplement a lot of the cost, but it's still a pretty significant lift for the state.
So what I hear you guys saying is you really need this. You do need this emergency fund.
This is probably one of the more critical components, I'd say, of this whole process. having the means to actually do the work when it's really needed.
Mhm.
This along with extra staff resources to implement a program, I think is where the rubber really meets the road, where we don't take kind of a hands-off approach to getting involved and getting stuff done, because, I really believe that for the most part, if dam owners had the money to do the repairs, they would. But hopefully we'd get ahead of the curve a little bit and be able to do something, or at least have this in our back pocket where if we can't compel compliance and the dam is in bad shape, we're not so reluctant to try to figure this out, because we would have the resources and the funding to be able to do it. So I think this is one of the bigger, you would get the most bang for the buck in an investment here, in my mind.
Yeah, and that's I'll just quickly add that's one of the reasons that I think we're presenting this general framework is I'll say it from my language, not theirs. I don't want any program staff, whether it's Lucas or Dan or whoever else, to have to beg, to keep the the public safe. They shouldn't have to beg the property owner, and on the flip side, they don't need to also be begging department directors who will have to try to find the money at great pain from other portions of a department budget. We need these folks to be able to take action when they see action needing to be taken, and not have to beg somewhere for it.
Thanks, Brad. Just a couple more comments, and I want to keep moving along here. Dan, looks like you wanted to say. Dan, did you want to say?
I was just gonna, add on to Brian's comments, but quite frankly, let's just keep moving on.
Okay, and then Douglas, did you
Yeah.
want to say something?
I do. Just want to point to an opportunity to combine this with other things that we might propose. We do not need to talk it out today. But the proposal that Brian and Bill and I prepared and that we discussed in the other committee would have each of basically the private dams paying through property tax assessment to the county toward the ultimate retirement and removal of the dam, as well as some other costs that counties should be collecting. One way of funding an emergency repair is actually to tap into whatever funds are in escrow for that purpose, and then have to replenish the escrow over time. But then you'd be pinning that cost on the individual dam owner rather than a collective. And I can see merits and demerits to both sides or both options. Just wanted to flag that for everybody to think about. We can discuss it at another time.
Yeah, that actually
Go ahead, Dan.
kind of ties in with that Pennsylvania program,
Yep.
what they do for the financial assurance program. And the fees for that program are actually based off of the cost of removing the dam or breaching the dam.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of feeds into that kind of life cycle plan, we'll say.
Yeah.
Douglas, just to make sure we capture this, then let's insert a note. I just want to be sure that we do that accurately so it doesn't get missed going forward.
I'd like to know a little more about that Pennsylvania program. Do they have what we've talked about in the other group, have a licensing program, or is it a one-time permit? And are all the dams permitted in Pennsylvania?
So they have a permitting program rather than licensure program.
But is it a renewable permit, or is it?
I
Is it
kind of
forever?
look into it. I believe it is renewable. I don't know what the duration is, but they're all permitted dams. They're not.
Every dam in Pennsylvania is permitted.
That's what I got out of it. Yes, and it's not you do a permit to do work on the dam. It's the dam itself is permitted.
Right, which is where we were trying to head, Douglas, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So whether you want to call it a licensure or permitting.
Right. I don't care what word you use. But if it's a renewable, that's where we want to be, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I apologize, I don't have everybody's emails readily available, but I did email the Pennsylvania's program, their information to Mark and Evan, so they can share that with the rest of the group.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so what I distill this down here, and I want to move on. There didn't seem to be any strong objections. In fact, it seemed like tacit support for the work that Brian had assembled, sort of the underpinning of the recommendation. So we'll memorialize that. That will be a supporting document that will be part of this subgroup's discussions to help inform events as we move ahead.
Okay, so the language is good as is with the addition of the language that was drafted.
That's what I understood for now, anyway.
Mhm.
That's what I understood.
Okay, great, thanks.
So I think the recommendation itself probably needs, I'll trust one of you to try to take a shot at redrafting just the very brief recommendation statement, like in the others. But the way 2020-05D is written, it's really not very close. So if Mark or Aaron, if you're comfortable kind of paraphrasing that to say, we support the creation of a dam emergency fund, and untie it from the permit fees at this point, and just kind of maybe see if you can just make it clear that we're supporting an emergency action fund.
Okay. Thank you, Brian, for that clarification.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like the things for us to explore is to determine whether a part of licensing fees might be a steady source of annual revenue, or possibly, as Dan pointed out, something that's more along the lines of a security bond, for example, might also be something that is a possibility for annual inputs. And if you need a hand with any drafting up, I think I got in my head the bullets that were intended. If you guys get busy, Mark and Aaron, but you guys are getting paid the big dollars for this. So $5 million, you got a floor, and maybe you say there's a ceiling. If you get to a ceiling, that the money spills over more directly into the loan fund. That was the only thing I was going to add as a concept or thought. Something tells me we're not going to be worried about ceilings in any funds related to infrastructure, but maybe I'm just a cynic now that I'm old.
Okay, so it sounded like just work on this language a little bit, Brian, decouple it from the other part, as you've mentioned here, to focus exclusively on an emergency fund.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
right.
And just I think one thing to capture too with that, decoupling is that last sentence. I at least recall Director Clark having some concerns about any of these funds somehow coming back and being tied to our budget or anything like that. So just the very end of that last sentence, where it's talking about excess funds going to engineering services contractor, DSP budget.
Yeah, that's supposed to be strike through. You can't strike through in a cell, but yeah, that's noted. Thank you.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you. Let's move, if you scroll down here a little bit here, you may recall we touched on this laundry list of activities that I call more administrative in nature, kind of beyond the purview of the time and the scope of the engagement here in the subgroup discussion. But I did want to let people know, I mean, if you have strong feelings or some thoughts on any one of these, I don't want to preclude you from providing some input. We're just simply not going to spend any time this afternoon, working on those issues. These are ones that Eagle has identified that they can really do within the scope, purview of their authority, assuming adequate resources are available, which is be the case, I suppose, for most of these. So does that give anyone heartburn on the subgroup?
From my standpoint, Mark, these are all management decisions, not policy
Right.
decisions.
Right, okay. All right, let's, what we wanted to leave time for is, it sounds like, new recommendations. And then to the extent there's any time beyond that, we can go back to Luke to talk more about, I think, with Pennsylvania. So let's kind of open it up. I didn't receive any, any new concepts in that form we sent out. It was just more of a template to get you thinking about recommendations and maybe reduce them to writing. So I don't know. Just kind of open it up if folks been thinking about anything that we haven't discussed, that it's sort of a glaring omission or otherwise that would benefit what we're trying to accomplish here. More money, more money, more money.
Bodies and dollars. That's what we need. Bodies and dollars.
Bodies and dollars.
Yeah, they used to teach us that water is the universal solvent, but it's starting to look like it's money.
Mark, I'll be a little bit of a broken record because I don't know where the same comment I've had a couple of times. I don't know where the right home is, which committee really, but really I think my other largest concern to come, that I would like to have come out of this is that, again, whether it's statutory or whether it falls into the flavor of program management, or whether it falls into enforcement compliance. I believe today there is authority to take actions and to escalate a compliance or an enforcement thing. But I think one of the things that keeps seeming clear to me is that there's probably a lot of benefit if we make the enforcement process more objective and clear cut, so that it's not left as a lot of subjectivity. So what I mean is, again, you can kind of hear there's a lot of art here of figuring out whether some property owner or dam owner is working with you in good, honest faith, or whether they kind of stringing you along for a long period of time, or whether they're stonewalling you. And again, I know that there is the authority to do it, but that often, I think in our program, or the way the statute reads, it's left a little unclear when you exercise that and under what situations you exercise it. And it seems like there could be room to look at how the different types of safety incidences arise and how they pertain to different hazard ratings. And is it possible to just make the process a bit more clear cut and objective, so that, say, a program staff person found themselves in a situation, is there a recipe that says, hey, you're a significant hazard, you have this type of an incident or condition at your dam, that means that the compliance process now is, you have 6 weeks to get back to me. Or else this will occur. We will come in and, potentially do a drawdown at 2 months. Whatever the situation requires or is appropriate. I keep wondering whether we can make our enforcement process a bit more objective.
Yeah, I guess I would turn, thank you for that, Brian, turn to Eagle staff just to see from their perspective. I mean, is it more of the not having the resources? They've got the authority. So if the resources follow, then maybe this kind of addresses your issue, right? They can be more, more proactive in pursuing those enforcement actions. Again, I don't want to put words in their mouth either. Let me.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I would love to hear from them, but some of the ASDSO recommendations talk about kind of, over the last 20 years, how have we done? Is there a flavor? Is there a culture? I think some of these situations that they encounter, you will be yelled at and second guessed no matter which decision you make. You'll either be overly aggressive or not aggressive enough. And it just seems like with some of these incidences, there might be just a fair, objective, precipitated action that could come from it. So,
Eagle staff, Luke or Dan, care to respond to that?
So I can
Oh, Amy. Hi, Amy.
talk about this in general for a minute, and then can kind of join in. But I do think our biggest limitation right now is staffing. We do have compliance and enforcement procedures that do have timeframes for moving processes along. And in fact, the department right now, I think Director Clark talked about this at one of our subgroup meetings, that there is a department procedure that's being worked on right now to basically have those timeframes you're talking about, Brian, across the department. We've always had those sort of rules of thumbs of what things, how long the process should take, but the department's going to be doing that. That's not in statute. I don't know if Luke and Dan think that we could find a way to have the flexibility that we need, but also have those timeframes in statute, because I think they're a good tool, but I'm just wondering what their thoughts are on trying to put it in the statute.
Yeah, I think, like you said, everything is so, one-off that you would have to take a risk-based approach like Brian was suggesting it. It maybe if we could have some criteria, I don't know if it even need to be in statute, it might just need to be in policy or procedure that says you're a risk category critical or high or something. And it could be a combination of those things that Brian just said. It's like the urgency of the repairs is there and the downstream impact is there. That puts you at the very top level where you have a very condensed time frame. Whereas if it's a low risk or the urgency of the repair isn't there, it puts you in a lower level where we take a more protracted time frame. And I don't know, I wouldn't want to try to capture every possible scenario and define those, but some less subjectivity of, like Brian is saying, is, assign them some type of risk category and that defines your timeline. I think that's probably a really good approach, because it lets us prioritize right now, because right now we're doing the very critical ones because we're triaging, right? Now it's like, well, we have a list, an approach that's risk-based, and we can say this is number one priority and this is number 10 or 15 or 20, and go from there based on whatever staffing and resource levels we have at our availability.
Yeah, and I think it will help out, especially in some of those interactions with both the owners and the potentially impacted public, because, we'll be able to point to a particular process. So when we're going to the owner, we can say, look, sorry, we realize you want to try and work towards this, but here's where you're obligated. You've got to get something done by this time. Similarly with the public, we can turn around and say, look, we're following the process. We're working through these steps. It's not that we're dragging our feet. This is how we're doing it, given, as Luke said, the risk profile associated with this issue. It's, that way there's not a perception from either side that we're too harsh or not harsh enough.
Comment on this topic too. I mean, I feel like you do need to have some flexibility. Like Luke said, you really can't come up with a document that spells out all the situations. Otherwise, you're just right back to kindergarten and nobody gets to go to recess because one person did something. And, that's the bane of a regulatory agency. Two things I really appreciated about the ASDSO report. If you look at how they ranked the priorities, you actually see a number of personnel things at near the top, but one of the top three is you got to have a strong leadership. And we've got a recommendation that lists a lot of bullets for what's included in strong leadership, but that's really where you do create that culture, right? It's a leader creating a culture of, we got to follow the rules, but we've got a goal and there's some flexibility in the rules to get to our goal. So I really like that piece. The other piece I liked, and I'm curious to hear what staff thinks, is certainly the idea of we're just focused on dam compliance in this meeting. That's a great rec. I like the part though where I'm looking for feedback is, because I think everybody's on board with that, it's a higher risk profile, so you really should be separate from all your other enforcement actions. But I like the recommendation to say that you should have dedicated enforcement staff. So here we've got Dan and Luke, and they're trying to work with people. They're trying to nudge them along. They're trying to have a relationship, really. And that relationship is what is part of the motivation of somebody and them trusting you. But at some point you run into that bad actor that's the reason the whole class has to stay inside at recess. And you'd love to be able to have your stick be, I got to turn it over to enforcement. Because do we really want our frontline people who, again, are trying to cajole people and work with people and understand that, you know, they really do have a unique situation that maybe we are going to, you know, cut them a little bit of slack. We don't want that group to also have to play hardball. You know, I like that idea. I don't know what staff feels like, if that's just too much navel gazing or what you guys think. So Amy, you got a thought?
Yeah, I do. And I'm really glad you brought that up, Evan, because when we were just talking a few minutes ago about the ones that the department can do, that's actually one of the recommendations in that list. So I guess my question for the subgroup is, are you thinking that you are going to say in your report that you support those items? Because that would really help us when we're trying to put together our plan and asking for funding for it. Is it that you're leaving those things to Eagle, or are you actually going to say that you support those ideas? Because I think that that's important. We can do them with support and funding and all those things, but if you completely stay neutral on it, then we don't have any recommendations from the task force on like staffing levels and how many people, like Evan said, there are for enforcement, or should there be money to improve the databases and things like that. So when we set those recommendations aside, we had said, well, could the subgroup maybe look at some general recommendations, and maybe Evan's staffing, including a couple enforcement staff, would be something that you could do.
I'm very comfortable with, if you guys can word those, give us language, I'd be very comfortable in endorsing those, you know, saying, in addition to these policy recommendations, here are some management decisions that should be supported. Okay. I'm very comfortable.
You can do that.
I want to just give a little history lesson here, and Douglas will know this. You know, what we're talking about now, this enforcement question, really is one we grappled with back in the 1970s. And created an environmental enforcement unit in the Department of Natural Resources, which included Eagle at the time. So there were enforcement officers that enforced all of the statutes, be it clean water, be it dam safety, be it air, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They were enforcement people. And then there was also environmental conservation, a handful of environmental conservation officers that, you know, were on the ground in those areas. And I'm not sure that was not a good idea at the time. It was a good idea.
Yeah, I experienced that same history, and I concur with Bill. And I think that, not to pontificate, but, you know, that is an issue that goes beyond dam safety.
Yes.
And I understand that it's not something that was just a choice by the department. It's a result of pretty steady pressure from the regulated over a couple, 3 decades now. So it's not an easy matter. And we all need to think about how we make it something that can last. But I absolutely agree that that was an effective tool back in the day, and I think it could be again.
It was basically decentralized, right, to each of the divisions. Water quality had their own C&E staff, land and water management, and other folks.
Yeah, that was the subsequent change, but that was
following the environmental enforcement, because they were doing their job really, really well and coordinated across the media.
There actually are still environmental officers. In the whole department splitting and rejoining and splitting again, they actually ended up in DNR. So it's a little bit of a clunky process, but we do have officers still that will help us. But it is way different than it was like 20 or 30 years ago, where they were more integrated into the programs.
Well, and they can deal with the on the ground situations, but you come to the broad legal strategy.
Yep.
That doesn't.
No, we use the AG's office for that almost exclusively.
So getting back to the recommendation and what would help Eagle staff here and looking at this, Amy and maybe others, is there a better way to phrase this there?
I feel like what Brian has brought up is valid, but it's really a part of those two recommendations that we've just talked about, really just about the having dedicated enforcement staff and having, I'm sorry, I don't know the number, and having a, regular meeting about dam enforcement. Those two things are kind of, this is sort of, Brian's raised an underpinning of those two things. Come up with what your rubric is for providing direction to the enforcement staff and for providing a framework for that, whether it's a monthly or quarterly meeting to evaluate, ongoing enforcement actions. That's what I feel like. I don't think it's a new recommendation necessarily. I think Brian's just asking the right questions about what do we mean by enforcement?
Yeah, and it's also, Evan, there's one in this lower table about having procedures specific to, right there, developing a DSP policy and procedures manual. And I'm thinking that would be a great place for what Brian's talking about. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to, it could be like a note that it's a recommendation that these include that sort of matrix.
Yeah,
I really didn't know whether it was, pertained to something over in the enforcement, whether, like I said, whether it is in like program management, if Amy, you're kind of discussing setting that up internally almost as guidance. For me, I just want to clarify though, like, I don't really think that this issue is a staffing based issue. I think what I'm thinking of specifically is there regardless of the number of staff people you have. It's really a favor. If you have a dam that's in a certain condition and you know that a certain high flow could cause the failure of it, you have to decide when it's okay to just keep working and keep working to compel compliance versus when it is time to take action. And that's a guessing game a bit, right? Because you don't know when the big flood's going to happen. So somebody could say, my risk aversion, and I don't want this dam to fail, I'm going to order it drawn down this summer. Well, guess what? You're going to have property owners who are going to be pretty in strong disagreement about the need to draw it down that summer. And they can use politics. They can come to their representatives, senators. They can come to an administration. It's really about what safety situations can we find ourselves in what is the right fixed course and timeline to take action. It's not really, to me, it's not about whether there's an insufficient number of staff. It's really about this judgment call about what time and risk aversion is there that I'm trying to figure out, at least for high and significant. Is there a way to say it so that we to say what an acceptable timeline is so we don't get anybody into guessing wrong in either direction? And because again, the downside of that is you can be second guessed and you guess whether you think you have time and you can be understanding or whether you need to be aggressive. And, when you put somebody into that subjective judgment call, if it goes wrong, it goes wrong for the person making the subjective judgment call. It's I guess that's my concept. I'm beating it to a dead horse. I know we got time management to worry about, but
let me just make one follow-up comment. The susceptibility of the program to political pressure does depend in part on how this discretion is formulated. And so this is a rough analogy, but on drinking water, we have primary standards and secondary standards. And the general nature of things is that if you violate the primary standards, you better get on the stick and fix it. If you have secondary standards, you should be trying to violations, you should be trying to address that, but there's a degree of discretion about when and how you get to it. And I think that's kind of what we're looking for here, is some zone where there isn't any real discretion. You've got to do it fairly fast. There's not an option for program staff to delay. And then there can be another zone of discretion where it kind of goes the other way. They can decide how hard to push, you know, based on the circumstances and so on. But if the whole program operates on discretion, it's more susceptible to outside pressure over time.
I think Aaron's kind of captured what Luke was trying to describe, you know, of his vision for this type of document. So at least we've got a placeholder, I feel, for Ryan's comment. I totally appreciate what's being.
Yeah, and I just wonder if we want to just add anything in there specifically about compliance and enforcement at the end of that, including, adequate resources for compliance and enforcement or something like that.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to suggest adding including enforcement.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and that echoes what ASTSO said. They said this progressive compliance and enforcement culture, or whatever they call that, is, where you don't just sit on things. There's a timeline when you move to the next step, until the problem's resolved. So I think that's good.
Okay. Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left. There are additional thoughts, recommendations that subgroup members and Eagle staff maybe that have been thinking about that you haven't seen and maybe surprised we haven't talked about or should talk about, whatever the case may be.
I do have a thought that I don't think it's a new recommendation, but it's really about trying to pin the money tail on the donkey kind of thing. So you've heard me say I like O3D, that risk-based approach. I presume that means we've got to have some an upgrade in data management software or however we're tracking things. I believe that's identified elsewhere. And we've also got in the appendices, again, the ASCE information identifies a need for $2 million. This is a recommendation that I think is carried through for quite some time, maybe since the mid-2000s. $2 million for data management software, but ASCE also identifies another $10 million that I'm not sure if it's consistent with a recommendation that I believe is currently under legislative. It's 11A, basically one that requires third-party engineering evaluation, and it's not on our list here. But I believe that's one that probably would take some money as well. But I think those two go hand in hand, right? It would be hard to really understand your risk profile if you don't have a better understanding of what era are these old dams actually suited for, So my feeling is there's at least $12 to $15 million in really getting to, maybe in 5 to 10 years, a tool that you can use on an annual basis to understand your risk. I also feel like you've got to have annual performance measures. And I've sent Amy some thoughts on, what are you guys measuring and what do you think you should measure? Because we do have a recommendation that, again, is related to 3D. It's about an annual report on the dam safety program. And I think that if 3D is appropriately at the top and we're talking about the whole goal is reduce risk, that should be the primary thrust of an annual report. The annual report maybe shouldn't be all about, what number of permits we issued and how many staff we have and this and that. That's all good, but you're really aiming towards how are we reducing risk. My point is just, I think we've got to be spending money on these things. I'm not sure where to start other than I think 3D and this 11A from elsewhere, if I understand it correctly, are somewhere in the $12 to $15 million range. And that's not for capital improvements. Always a risk to go to the legislature with appropriations that aren't for physical improvements, that are for thinking and doing better. So just my thought, I don't know that we need to solve today.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we were to make any changes to the language anywhere here, do you see an opportunity to do that, Evan, or just want us to capture that note?
I don't have an opportunity to top of mind, and it'd probably be boring for people. I'm happy to drill down on that a little bit, just in the 2 or 3 recommendations that I specifically mentioned. I think some of it is making sure that it's clear what we've included, what, that we scope this out enough, because I feel like it's going to be hard to hit the nail on the head with dollar amounts, but we're still going to have to do that. We still have to throw dollar amounts in here. But a lot of these are going to be, somebody's going to be working on this 2 years from now, and they really need to understand what their mission is. And they really need to reevaluate, is that the right dollar amount for my mission? So.
Okay. And yeah, I think there'll probably be some more opportunity as we start to look more globally at all the different funding needs, Evan, to weave that in, right? So we've got about 5 minutes left. I guess, Luke, thanks for the offer to go back to talk about Pennsylvania. I think we don't have the time, and I just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about next steps, and that is preparing for, I think it's Monday's full task force meeting. And the agenda is evolving, but primarily the focus will be having report outs by the subgroups and start to better understand the relationship of some of the recommendations and overlap. We're working behind the scenes to sort of mitigate that and find opportunities to make them complementary where possible. But again, it's iterative process and evolving. So as I started out in the meeting talking about, we are looking for a volunteer from this subgroup just to talk at sort of a high level. I don't think it's going to be more than 10 minutes, maybe with Q&A, to talk about or sort of summarize our discussions here, where our focus was, some of the things what were primary concern to us. And then obviously we won't be getting to the details of the language of the recommendations, but they can better understand the context and how we arrived where we did. So is there anyone there that might offer up to do that for us for this subgroup on Monday?
I'm fine with doing it. Ryan hasn't written down somebody else's name that he thinks offered to do it.
I missed a note. Was there a note, Brian? Did he nominate himself? No.
I'm fine doing it. I mean, I'd nominate Bill if I was going to nominate somebody, but I don't want him to be mad at me either.
Well, you're the chair.
You volunteered before I did, Evan. You volunteered before I did. I had unmuted my mic, but I was too late.
Yeah, but he's the chair of the task force, Bill. He's doing all the talking here. I kind of like his suggestion. I think, you got a good handle on this.
Yeah. What do you say, Bill? You want to do it?
Okay, I'll do it. Mark, you'll get me some stuff beforehand?
Yes, we'll be in touch, Bill.
Okay, good.
Like I said, pretty high level. You had some good thoughts to add here too, so I think it should come off just fine.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, and I guess my last, I have just one more question for Amy. So in terms of these, the lower, things that are left for Eagle, am I correct in that you or someone from Eagle will draft a overall recommendation that will say, that the task force, approves Eagle to, or supports these recommendations for Eagle to carry through? Amy or anyone from
in the final report, I'd envision something like this. I just say, in addition to the policy recommendations made within this report, there are a series of management decisions that need to be undertaken by the department and its staff, and they would include, something like that.
And we endorse those,
and something about we endorse those.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things too that Amy was getting at before is a statement along the lines of, in addition to supporting these, we support, the funding and staffing necessary to accomplish these.
Yeah, I'd add that language would be good. Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a strong emphasis on the funding in the narrative and in many areas. So
Most of those are pretty okay, but since we haven't discussed it, the what is it, 5A? Can you scroll down to 5A? Is that a problem with the department? Do you like that, or is that going to cause you a problem? I know it's minor, but if we are saying we, support all of these, that's one, like Amy, did that cause a problem if we support that?
I don't know if she signed off or maybe she's got a bad connection. Luke, you were going to weigh in here?
Yeah, I think her mic must be, but yeah, that's the 80 to 100,000 roughly that we get annually from FEMA as part of the National Dam Safety Program grant. Right now, that goes primarily to staff salaries and fringes. So the emphasis, that's not really the intent of that grant. It's meant to supplement dam safety programs, not support dam safety programs, and they give them to all the states. So it would remove the emphasis from salaries and fringes and put it more to like training, equipment, IT, stuff like that might be tougher to get, from our general fund contributions, and save the general fund for salaries and fringes type of thing. So repurpose that money. So I think that was supported by Amy. She can text or whatever, but
Yeah.
It's minor. I just didn't want to without talking, cause half of your existing staffing budget to go away.
That's what I recall, and the presumption would be a lot of new money would come online. So, right, you would have the opportunity to embrace this recommendation once additional resources are available, right? So,
correct.
Good.
Yeah. Okay, good. This brings us to the close of the meeting. I really appreciate everyone's time and side work getting us here today. Excellent discussion. I think we've got a good hand. I'm feeling like we're sort of 90% there on the recommendations. We're going to spend some additional time between now and Monday. We'll contact each of those that have volunteered to do the report outs for the groups. So with that, thank you all again for your time, expertise, and engagement here. Have a great Thanksgiving wherever you find yourself. Be safe. And we do have a lot to be thankful for. So with that, everyone have a good evening, and I'll see you soon.
Great.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mark. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.